So amateurism and professionalism in sport. Your specification requires you to understand the meanings of those two things. What did it mean in the 19th century to be an amateur or professional, and what does it now in the 21st century? And also to appreciate how structurally and organisationally we have moved away from a traditional amateur approach towards a more professional approach to our sport. So in the past, in the 19th century, amateurs were wealthy gentlemen who were very good at their sport, very rich, and didn't need to be paid to play. In fact, it was considered a bad thing to be paid to play sport at that time. So these were competent players but happened to be wealthy people. On the other hand, the working class professionals were competent working class people who needed to be paid, who couldn't afford not to be paid. If they were going to take time away from work playing sport, they needed to compensate for that income. And then sport became their job. But they were very much looked down on by the amateur gentlemen. So there's a sort of a hierarchy, really. The amateur gentlemen looking down on the working class paid professionals. What determined professionalism in the 19th century was your social status or class. You were a professional if you had to be paid, the lower working class, and you were an amateur if you didn't have to be paid and didn't want to be paid. It was a bad thing to be paid and get money at this stage. So today's society, now amateurism is very much people who play sport for the love of it. It's not to do with being paid. In fact, you're not paid. And if anything, if you're amateur, you're considered not quite as good as the professionals. But it's done for fun. It's not done in a serious way. Whereas professionalism is what a lot of young people aspire to be when they grow up, because you can get paid now. It is a positive thing. You do have status. You can be proud of that. So you're considered almost superior if you're a professional in the 21st century. It's a multi-million-dollar pound business. So we've had a distinct shift in what was considered acceptable from the 19th to the 21st century. And what determines professionalism in the 21st century is being paid, whereas in the 19th century it was your social status that determined this. And it's a good thing considered in this sort of decade, because you can support yourselves, you have a very healthy lifestyle, and you have status and credibility. Pause the video, have a little glance at this. This is just really a context for you, looking at how football and cricket have viewed the differences in these kinds of amateurs and professional perspectives. So we've also changed in terms of a broader approach to sport. Historically, we've had an amateur approach to sport, which has typically been quite unreliable and inconsistent and disorganised and inefficient. Not a great thing. Communication between organisations has been poor. There's been a lot of overlap with the roles of these organisations, so a lack of clarity of who is supposed to be organising or doing what. And control is decentralised, so individual organisations controlled themselves, which meant that getting a coordinated approach to sport and provision was quite poor. So things really haven't come from a brilliant place in terms of structure and organisation, and we've relied hugely on volunteers to run organisations. In fact, national governing bodies started off as volunteers, and clubs are still currently often run by volunteers. Nowadays, though, there's significantly greater professional approach to sport. We have structure at both ends, mass participation and sporting excellence, extremes of a continuum. We have a network of support facilities for our elite athletes, as you can see from these images, and we get a lot of success from it. So people are more specialist and expertise, they're skillful, and it's a much more proficient approach. There's structure and organisation. There's definition in more case between organisations, and to be honest, organisations have been forced to improve and get better and get more structured, and that's largely because they're reliant on funding. And if they don't produce in the current climate, if they don't produce success, then they don't get their funding. If they don't get more people at the excellence end winning medals, they don't get their funding. If they don't get more people engaged in an active, healthy lifestyle, they don't get their funding. So administratively and structurally and in terms of specialist standards, we've become much, much more professional in our approach to sport. Here's an exam question, just really asking about the characteristics of high-level sport, so where we've come to in this professional way. And again, much of this I'm sure you'll appreciate, so just pause the video and have a look at this mark scheme. Again, another short exam question asking you to convey the important key points about our shift from this traditional amateur poor approach to sport to a more professional approach to the organisations. And here's the mark scheme at this. So we've got a description of what it means to be traditional and more professional in terms of our approach, and then we've got some factors. So the old system was much more complicated, now it's much more defined. The old system was more ineffective, now it's much more proficient. Modern sport needs to be results driven. We need to get a lot more people taking part in activity. The national governing bodies have had to organise themselves to keep their funding, and ultimately we hope to raise standards, get more gold medals and look good on the world stage. So why has it happened? We've kind of talked about it a little bit in the last sort of couple of slides with the exam questions. Why move to this much more professional approach? And there's a few here to acknowledge. So success on the world stage, pressure. Actually, this point actually relates to pressure within sports. So the example here being rugby union, which is a professional sport, and rugby league, which is an amateur sport. And rugby divided and partly became union and partly became league. But undoubtedly, rugby league organisations and structure will be pressured perhaps to consider going professional. I would imagine some athletes would shift to play rugby union because they can get paid for it. The media obviously has a very important role in terms of professionalism and providing money and providing sponsorship, and there's another drive to be a professional and to get the benefits of that. And obviously media links in with making sport much more entertaining and having spectators and audiences, and it's all really money related, this drive for professionalism, and makes it possible, to be honest. And athletes who are professional have a much greater opportunity provision and esteem as a result of it, which we need them to have in order to succeed. Pros and cons then, amateur versus professional. Advantages of amateurism is there's no pressure, it remains fun, standard and ability is not an issue, so it's very inclusive, anybody can take part, and you can do it whenever, you can do it part-time, there's no overwhelming commitment. However, sometimes it is the case where the coaches or the facilities are not quite as high level as they could be, and if you're an amateur playing at a high level, so you don't have to be low level to be amateur, you can be a good performer who happens to be involved in an amateur sport. And if that's the case and you want to train hard and play at this high level, what it means is you've got to sustain your probably full-time job as well as doing all the great volume of training and competing that you're involved in, and that's pretty tough. Advantages of professionalism, well, you potentially get much more specialised, high quality coaches and facilities. You obviously get a salary, you get paid for it. There's less pressure on you to have to keep a job, and you can commit to your training full time. However, with this comes a lot of pressure from and accountability from sponsors. So if they're putting money into you, they want to get the success. It might become less about fun, it might be it probably is a much greater commitment in terms of your lifestyle, and you need to commit full time to this. Don't underestimate the role of volunteers in promoting sport, because often there are volunteers who are officials, who are coaches, who do, or your manager, organise stuff, do the fixtures, do the teams. So grassroots levels, the mass participation level in particular, is a lot to do with volunteer support. And this is often perceived as a very amateur approach. It's not necessarily true, but it's possible that volunteers might have the goodwill, but might not have the organisation, the structure and the skill and the standards to be as good as perhaps a professional approach might be. And actually, though, recently the National Lottery has really helped put more money into encouraging volunteers maybe to get coaching qualifications, to give grassroots community more financial support in order to increase the provision for them. So what's the role of the government been in sports development? Well, historically, not so brilliant. They've had very little interest in sport, and given very little support, certainly financially to sport, been very inconsistent and erratic. However, more recently, I think governments have possibly seen the credibility and the value of sporting success, particularly on the world stage, and in terms of a healthy, happy nation and reducing health bills elsewhere. So there's been much more supportive and much more financial support into sport and sport development. It's become much more serious and focused. And as I said, the NHS has driven to increase mass participation, ultimately to save money for themselves. Lastly, then, some key organisations that you need to be comfortable with: the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, the government department responsible for sport, the Department for Education, which is ultimately sort of in charge of PE, but the Youth Sport Trust is significantly working with the government in terms of PE and sport provision for young people. And then, of course, we've got national governing bodies who cater for sport, both at the mass participation and sporting excellence end of the spectrum. And here's just a very brief description of those organisations for you. Lastly, just to recap really, we've shifted from an amateur to a much more professional approach, and we've shifted from seeing amateurism, shifted in the 19th century, amateurism being for wealthy people, whereas the professionals were the working class poor people, and today professionals are the people who are paid to do sport, who typically can be quite wealthy.